Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of YFP Planning's fee-only certified financial planners. Before we jump into today's question, I want to give a shout out to YFP Planning's incredible team that makes this segment possible. YFP Planning offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning that is customized to the pharmacy professional. You can learn more and book a free discovery call by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. All right, this week's question comes from the Your Financial Pharmacist Facebook group, where an individual asks, I'm considering cashing in a traditional IRA. I know about the 10% penalty for early withdrawal, and we'd like to hold out the 24% tax upfront for federal taxes and 5% for state taxes. Is there anything I'm missing? People say they regret it come tax time. We can hang on to this money until tax season to make sure we held enough out. We have a separate 401k for retirement, so this is not something we're relying on for retirement. Tim Baker, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't understand this question, Tim. So I'm gonna go a little bit on a rant. So just bear with me. It's one of the it's probably one of those things. Like I never want to talk in absolutes because that's never an advantageous position that you put yourself in. But I think that this is one of the ones that you're like you shouldn't do this, even if you say you're not going to rely on it for retirement. Another one is always get the match, which in I think 95% of cases you want to make sure that you're getting the match outside of a lot of credit card debt. So first I want to talk about the mechanics, and then I want to kind of talk about some alternatives.
Yeah.
So typically, you can go in at any time, and typically the penalty that we think of is before you reach age 59 and a half,
Mm-hmm.
you have that 10% penalty right off the top, and then you're paying both federal and state income taxes. So if you use a calculator here for this particular scenario, let's just say that the person submitting the question is withdrawing $10,000. So they see $10,000 sitting there and they're like, I want access to that. Let's just say they're age 30, so they're well below the age 59 and a half. Federal income tax rate of 24%, state income tax rate of 5%. So after you take out that 10,000, essentially what you get to net or keep is $6,100. So yeah. So the taxes are going to be about 2,900. So 24 plus 5%, that's 2,900. You
Mm-hmm.
take the 10,000 off the top, so that's 1,000. So that's essentially 3,900 between the taxes and the penalties, which leaves you $6,100. So there's no scenario where I'm like, hey, that's a good idea. So and the mechanics of this is typically, with regard to IRAs, unlike retirement plans, custodians are not, or like a 401k, custodians are not required to essentially withhold the taxes for you. So to the questioner's point, is like it could hurt at tax time because all of a sudden you now have $3,000 or $2,900 that you have to come up with to pay Uncle Sam, and you're like, oh, I spent it.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of like, oh, we can hang on to this cash until tax time, again, that doesn't compute with my brain, because it doesn't sound like it's an immediate
Right.
emergency or
Thought the
anything
same
like that.
thing. Mm-hmm.
So the answer is just like no, like don't do this, because it just doesn't make any sense to basically reach into your pocket, give away 10%, and pay taxes on something that is a preferred tax account, because it's in an IRA. Don't do it. So the alternatives is, the question I would ask, from the question that's stated here is, why not just take a loan against the 401k?
Mm-hmm.
Again, you're going to pay some penalties, or not necessarily penalties, but sometimes they'll charge you a fee, like the custodian for the 401k will charge you a fee to take out a loan. But that's going to be a heck of a lot better, I think, Tim, than
Yeah.
taking the haircut that we're talking about. So that would be number one. I don't know if it's like, hey, we just don't want this account hanging out here, and maybe it's a little bit of laziness. I would not pay that penalty just to kind of like tighten things up. You can always roll the 401k or the IRA into your 401k if you want to
Yeah.
do that. So the other thing though I want to talk about is there are ways at least to avoid the 10% penalty. Um, so even if you're still under 59 and a half years old, one of them is if this penalty is for large medical expenses. So you can pay up to you can pay medical expenses that exceed 7.5% of your adjusted gross income if they've been unreimbursed. So for a lot of people, unless you have a ton of medical expenses, it's
Huge.
not going to help
Mhm.
you. Um, if you've been laid off or essentially unemployed, you can pay your health insurance premiums with an IRA without a penalty for 12 weeks or more. You can pay college costs, so basically
Mhm.
qualified education expenses, which is essentially everything: tuition fees, room and board, textbooks. And this could be for kids, yourself, spouse, it could be for grandkids. You don't have to pay a 10% penalty for that. Another one, Tim, is like if we're using this because, and this is probably what I would surmise it is, um, first time home buyer, you can use up to $10,000 for that, and this basically means first time home buyers like you haven't owned a home in the last 2 years, so it's a little bit generous. If you are adopting a baby, or there's costs related to a birth of a child that you didn't expect, you can use some of that without penalty. If you're disabled, if you are on military service and you need money for that, um, these are all reasons. Again, I would probably consider a Roth IRA withdrawal before I would do a
Yeah.
traditional. Um, so these would all be things that I would assess before I would take that money, because if I can justify it, at least I'm saving $1,000 in this example on the penalty. But even so, I think there are ways to kind of access cash without necessarily taking the tax hit and the penalty
Mhm.
hit up front. And again, this is another reason I know a lot of people's emergency funds are hurting right now, and credit card balances in the economy are moving up.
Yeah.
But this is the whole reason of like baby stepping into the financial plan, making sure that your consumer debt is in check, and more importantly in this situation, there's an emergency fund there. Even though the question is kind of confusing, because it's like we don't really necessarily need this money now, but we're going to access it anyway. So that's just some food for thought.
Yeah, same thoughts, Tim. Great insights there. I think the first question is, really digging into why, like what's the reason, right? We don't have that information, with the question here. Same thoughts, probably a first time home buy, but is there something else going on? Doesn't sound like it's emergent just based on the comment of, hey, we can hang on this money until tax season to make sure we're holding out enough taxes. But I like also, once we address kind of the why and are there alternative pathways, to consider based on the goal, whatever is trying to be achieved here, is there different ways that we could be creative? So is it a 401k loan, right? As you mentioned, are there Roth dollars that are available? Maybe there are emergency dollars, but for emotional reasons, there's not wanting to withdraw on those for some reason, right? So this to me is such a great example where, I often share and teaching drug information with students back in the day. Like there's the question, and then there's the questions behind the question. And it's really answering those to really get at the heart of what are we trying to accomplish? And then what are the strategies that we can employ to be able to address what the goal is without having maybe as sizable of a negative impact as the taxes would in this case.
Yeah, and I would say maybe some overconfidence here. That I'm picking up. I think at the end of the day, the question comes from a good place in terms of like we need to plan for a potential tax
Yeah.
bill, and I would say set about a third aside. But people that are, I think people again, sorry, you're getting the rant and Tim today. People that are building wealth, year over year, quarter over quarter, month over month, they're not doing things like this.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, so this is one of those things that's like there's probably, I would want to go down a lot of different pathways before going
Yeah.
down this one. And again, it's like 10% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you take into account the taxes and everything else, it doesn't
Yeah.
doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And that really jumped out to me as well, Tim. I think that it happens, right? People will make this mistake without understanding or knowing some of the tax implications, the penalty, the 10%, and some folks make that once, never happens again. Right. But I think what's interesting here is there's pretty good awareness into what would be the implications. of this, and they're running the same app that you're running. So I think that's another factor here.
Yeah, and if this has happened to me, Tim, like I didn't necessarily do the withdrawal voluntarily, but I had a small 401k that, I was notified that if I didn't roll it over or do something with it, it was going to be cashed out. And that's what happened. I was not necessarily in the best place in my life. So I wasn't necessarily paying attention to these things. I wasn't in financial services, but I got this check and I'm like, oh, and I knew I was going to be
Hmm.
penalized for it. And
Yeah.
it was menial. So this isn't, the judgment zone. I'm just saying, like, if we're a student enough to ask this questions, I think this question, which I applaud it, we should be a student enough to kind of look at some of the
Yeah.
alternatives and see if there's a better way. So this is not it's not a judgment. It is one of those things where it's like, you know don't have credit card debt, have an emergency fund, don't
Yeah.
buy more house than you need, and don't cash out a retirement,
Yeah.
account if you can get around it. So those are some of the ones that I would put up there. And so, yeah.
Great stuff, Tim. And again, this question for this episode came from the Your Financial Pharmacist Facebook group. A little over 9,000 pharmacists all across the country that are involved in that group. If you're not yet a member, I hope you'll consider joining that group. And if you have a question for an upcoming episode on this podcast, we would love to hear from you. You can send us an email, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com, or you can also record your question by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask YFP. As we wrap up this week's segment of the podcast, an important reminder that the content is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information on the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. For more information, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.